John J. Navin is a professor of history at Coastal Carolina University, where he teaches American history. He holds a master's degree in American Studies from Boston College and a Ph.D. in history from Brandeis University. Dr. Navin is the author of The Grim Years, Settling South Carolina, 1670 to 1720, published by the University of South Carolina Press in 2020. Let's give a big hand for our speaker, Professor John Navin.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to start by asking, are there any folks here who served in Vietnam? Could I ask you to stand up just for a moment? Would you stand up, please? Thank you. Thank you for your service. Are there any folks here who had relatives who served in Vietnam who aren't here today? Well, on our behalf, thank you. Thank you for their service. Okay. Because certainly, as we all know, war is something that affects not just soldiers. It certainly affects people in the war zone and a lot of people outside of the war zone. I teach American history at Coastal Carolina University, and you might say, well, is the Vietnam War really American history? So, in a sense, I'm looking at it from an American perspective. If you were listening to a speaker who taught about the Vietnam War from the Vietnamese perspective, I'm sure there would be some very different things they'd focus on, some different views, some different reactions. I want to make it clear from the outset, I'm not a soldier. I never have been a soldier. I had the good fortune to be in the University of Massachusetts at Boston from 1968 to 1972. Had I not done that, I had a good chance of learning how to shoot an M16. But I didn't have that experience, and by the time I finished my studies at UMass, we were in the phase of the war that Nixon would describe as the Vietnamization phase or program, and so they had stopped sending boys over. So I was very fortunate, but as you know, many young men and women weren't nearly as fortunate as me. What I'd like to do to start today is to just remind you, not that you necessarily need reminding, but it's good to start by talking about the boogeyman. And in this case, we're talking about communism, okay? Communism, different definitions. When I teach the colonial America class, and I'm teaching about the founding of Jamestown, the founding of Plymouth, there's a quote from William Bradford, governor of Plymouth in 1622, where he talks about the conceits of the ancients, meaning Plato and Aristotle, who said that a propertyless society where everything was held in common was vain. It was a conceit because they tried it in Plymouth for the first few years and it didn't work. So this idea of communism, or you might try and brand it socialism to some degree, has been around for a very long time. But the textbook definition of communism would be something like this: a theory advocating the elimination of private property. Goods are owned in common and available to everyone as they need them. But the communism that we feared, the boogeyman communism, is more the second definition, a doctrine based on Marxian socialism and the teachings of Marx and Lenin, the official ideology of the Soviet Union. And looking at that in more detail, a totalitarian system of government in which a single authoritarian party controls the means of production. And so this was something that was very different, inimical to American values, to the idea of free market, of democracy, of free trade, and so forth. The real fear of communism in the United States really comes in two stages. The first is the Red Scare of the 1920s. And in that Red Scare, the conditions following the First World War, massive unemployment, the return of thousands and thousands of troops who now were looking for jobs. There was already massive unemployment. There were a lot of labor movements, there were strikes, there were a lot of issues with immigrants competing for those jobs, immigrant laborers, but also the fear of immigrant anarchists. And so this all came together into this great Red Scare in the 1920s. That more or less died down, went away as we approached the Great Depression. But then there was a second Red Scare, and this was the Red Scare of the early 50s. And you probably know of, or maybe even remember some of this. Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, who claims that there's over 200 communists in the State Department alone. And so the Senate creates this committee to root out these communists from the government, from the armed forces. And McCarthy, of course, goes beyond that. We see the purge of actors in Hollywood and screenwriters and so forth who might have communist sympathies or tendencies or be card-carrying members of the Communist Party. There were, in the 1920s, there were genuine anarchists, and there certainly were devoted or dedicated communists in the United States, and we did our best to deport them or arrest them. McCarthy was much trying to do the same, but he was doing it in a different time, a different environment. And so that's what I wanted to put in your heads as we begin this discussion of Vietnam. And I'll just remind you that we're talking about the beginning of the Cold War. We're talking about the beginning of the nuclear arms race. And some of these pictures might remind you of things. I know I did this, maybe some of you did too. Getting under the desk at school because that was the safe place when the big bomb dropped, right? I've seen government-issued films where a family is out having a picnic and they see the bomb go off and they all get under the blanket that they have for their picnic. And so just crazy notions about how to prepare. We have here an article, I'm not sure which magazine, this could have been Life, Look magazine, any popular magazine. Family in the shelter, snug, equipped, and well organized. The fallout shelters became quite the rage in the 1950s as we prepared as best we could for a nuclear war. And there was a genuine threat as both the United States and Russia built up their nuclear arsenals. And in 1963, Red China would join that, the nuclear club, if you will. And the threat was indeed genuine. And as you know from the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came very close to stepping over the edge. So now let's switch the focus here and talk about Vietnam. There's a new series out on Vietnam, a 5-part video series that's on Netflix. And the first episode starts with JFK, and I saw it, and I thought, this is just crazy. You can't start talking about the Vietnam War, talking about JFK. And the truth is that they've put the backstory in the second episode of that series, so you'll start to get some of this. And that is that Vietnam was, over the years, subject to the presence of outsiders, of invaders, if you will. And the ones that we'll start with will be the French, who in 1858 moved into Vietnam using Christian persecution of Christians as their excuse or to legitimize their presence. And they went in and basically took over not just Vietnam, but much of Southeast Asia. French rule became the order of the day. They profited handsomely from the products of Southeast Asia, including massive rubber plantations. So let's now allow this fellow to enter the picture, the discussion, and that's Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, as a young man, had one great goal in life, and that was to unify his country that for so long had been subject to foreign domination. Okay? He wanted his country to be independent. He wanted his country to be unified. And here he is in 1921. The First World War has ended. They're having these discussions in Paris, and he goes to Versailles. He goes there to try and be heard, and nobody will listen to this young Vietnamese man. And he's trying to plea his case for an independent Vietnam. So he spends quite some time outside of Vietnam. He actually works in a restaurant in Boston. He works in, that's the Parker House, if you know Parker House rolls. Well, he worked in there. He worked in Paris. He was in England, I believe, for a while. He goes over to Russia and spends some time in Russia. Here he is in Hong Kong in 1930 in a prison, placed there by the British. Again, this is a man who is trying to get his country unified and independent. We think of him as a dedicated communist, which he was, but his priority was not to make his country communist, it was to make his country independent. And that's important to keep in mind. In the Second World War, the Chinese are the invading force. They push the French out, or some French stay, but they become under Chinese control. And the Chinese will not only rule in Vietnam, but they'll commit a fair number of atrocities there. And so Ho Chi Minh leads a guerrilla movement, a resistance movement against the Chinese. And what's the old saying? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, or something to that effect, okay? Well, our enemy at this point, we were fighting some of the same forces. We were fighting as allies to Chiang Kai-shek, but we were fighting against forces that came in, I'm sorry, I said Chinese. My apologies, Japanese. We were fighting the Japanese forces, and Ho Chi Minh and his men were fighting against them. So we allied with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, M-I-N-H, Viet Minh. There are pictures, as a matter of fact, I've got one to show you, pictures of our men with Ho Chi Minh and his men as allies. Ho Chi Minh founds the Indonesia Communist Party in 1930, and it's during this Japanese occupation of Vietnam that we begin to work with him and with the communists. And as you know, during World War II, even though we had gone through the Red Scare already of the 1920s, Russia was our ally against the Germans. So we were in bed with the same folks who would become our enemies. Here's Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh National Independence Coalition. And they will battle the Japanese occupation force. And here's a picture, I'll try to get out of your way here. Here's a picture of our OSS. This is the early version of the CIA. And here they are with Ho Chi Minh and with the man who will become his leading general, okay, Giap, General Giap. And we are there as advisors and as allies in this common battle against the Japanese. When the war ends, that is a moment that if Roosevelt had his way, Vietnam could have become an independent nation. FDR, here he is in 1944. Indochina should not go back to France. I'm wholeheartedly supported in this view by Chiang Kai-shek and by Marshal Stalin. The case of Indochina is perfectly clear. France has milked it for 100 years. The people of Indochina are entitled to something better than that. But as you know, FDR dies before the war ends. It's Harry Truman who's in office who orders the bombs to be dropped on Japan. And after FDR's death, you have de Gaulle starts to play what he considers his trump card. You can look at this as the French just trying to make the best of a difficult situation, given that the French had been under German occupation and they're just trying to recover from the war. But what they want is to get back into Vietnam, to reestablish that flow of money coming from those rubber plantations, to reestablish those trade routes. And to do that, they couldn't respect the wishes of FDR. They couldn't stay in a hands-off situation. The French need to get back into Vietnam. The United States is saying, we don't want you to do that. So de Gaulle says, we don't understand your policy. What are you driving at? Do you want us to become one of the federated states under the Russian aegis? We do not want to become communist. We do not want to fall into the Russian orbit. And I hope you will not push us into it. So here is the leader of France saying to us, if you don't support us in our effort to get back into Vietnam, right, then we could very well let you down in Europe. We could, in fact, become trapped or drawn into the Russian orbit, into the Soviet orbit. That's the last thing that we wanted, given that we're trying to unify Western Europe, because you know after the war, when Germany falls, Berlin will be divided, right? East Berlin will be communist controlled. West Berlin, the Allies and the United States in particular, will control that. And so even though the communists have been, or Russia has been our ally, it's very clear very quickly that now we're adversaries, and we need France and other nations to basically hold those Russian forces back. There will become what will be known as the Iron Curtain. I believe Churchill is the one who coins that phrase. So you could look at this as blackmail, you could look at it as a threat, but it's France saying we need to go back in there and we need your support. So the Potsdam Conference, you can see Harry Truman here with Stalin and Churchill, and France wants to return to Southeast Asia and get back their former colonies of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And Harry Truman abandons the position of FDR, or maybe you could say he found the position taken by FDR to be untenable, because he's trying to maintain our policy, uphold our policies in Europe, and FDR never made it that far. And so he's willing to sacrifice Vietnam, the Vietnamese people, in the interests of American interests in Europe and the interests of other nations. In other words, Vietnam is small fry compared to the needs of these larger countries. And so what we get is the Vietnamese, on their own part, declare their independence. And you should recognize the language here. All people are created equal, right? Endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson certainly would recognize this language. They have been our allies. They're asking for their independence. They're saying they have the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact, they are that already. And they are appealing to the United States. And Ho Chi Minh writes letter after letter to Harry Truman, saying, we're allies. We've worked with you. Won't you support us? We need to stop the French. But Harry Truman has indicated otherwise to the French. The U.S. has no thought of opposing the reestablishment of French control in Indochina. It's not the policy of this government to assist the French to reestablish their control over Indochina by force. So in one light, you could say, what we're doing is we're putting the need to stop the Soviets in Europe above the need to preserve the independence of the Vietnamese people. We will sacrifice the air interests to maintain the alliance, the friendship, the support of the French themselves. That's one way you could look at what's happening. Another way of looking at this is that the United States is very concerned about communism and the Soviet Union, which is why I started out with those slides, to remind you, okay, that we have by this time the beginnings of a Cold War. We have the bomb. In 1945, the Russians don't. But we know that they are a formidable opponent. And in 1948, the Russians do have the bomb. And so the Cold War is officially underway at that point. So what we need is we need to stop the communists wherever we can, a policy of containment. But we don't want to take American boys and send them all over the world to do that. We need other people to do the fighting. And if this has a familiar sound to it, you can say, what's going on in Ukraine? The United States has been pouring money and material into fighting the Soviet Union or fighting Russia, but we've done our very best to keep American troops out of the fray, right? So that's the intention here of the United States government. The French do go back to Vietnam, and there's an incident in which some French troops get killed. And they retaliate by bombing Haiphong Harbor in the north in 1946, kill over 6,000 Vietnamese. And the Viet Minh, the troops under Ho Chi Minh, will retaliate weeks later. And with that, the Indochina War is underway. And this war will go from December 1946 up to May 1954. You see some numbers here. Deadly war. Okay? And the casualties, of course, are not just troops, they're also civilians. And this effort by the French to recolonize Vietnam will end miserably at Dien Bien Phu, when the French forces will be defeated in 1954. When the Pentagon Papers come out during the Vietnam War, one of the things they show is this text. The record shows that through 1953, the French pursued a policy which was based on military victory and excluding meaningful negotiations with Ho Chi Minh. There was a basic incompatibility in US policy. Washington wanted France to fight the anti-communist war and win, preferably with US guidance and advice. But, and here's where you have to wonder what kind of drugs these people were taking. Washington expected the French, when the battlefield victory was assured, to magnanimously withdraw from Indochina. So we'll help you win this war, and once you've won it, then you will, of course, pull your troops out and allow Vietnam to become independent. So right now you could sit and say, stop. We've gone Hollywood. This is unrealistic. Better rewrite this script because it's ridiculous. This is out of the Pentagon Papers. This was actual US policy based on this kind of thinking. Then we get into the domino theory, which I know you're all familiar with, right? Eisenhower, April 1954, you have a row of dominoes, you knock over the first one. And in this case, different countries. Each domino is a different country. Asia, after all, has already lost some 450 million of its people to communist dictatorship, and we can't afford greater losses. Because by this time, not only has Russia just dropped the bomb, right? They are now a nuclear power with our help. You can read about the Rosenbergs and others, okay? But Red China is now a communist nation. When the war ends, Red China is not under communist rule, but by the time it is. So this is like a 1-2 punch for the Americans. And Eisenhower says, we can't let them win in Vietnam because if they do there, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and so forth. Here's more from the Pentagon Papers. This is Secretary Dulles making it clear he would not permit the loss of Indochina in the manner that the Democrats had allegedly allowed the loss of China. So now we're getting into deep politics, right? Now it's going to become a matter of party and blame. Dulles warned China not to intervene and urges the French to drive towards a military victory. Dulles was opposed to a ceasefire and tried to dissuade the French from negotiations with the Viet Minh. So basically, we want the fight to continue until the French are victorious. And again, Dien Bien Phu put an end to all that. That's where the French basically are encircled, and through brilliant generalship and incredible hardship for the Viet Minh fighters, they overrun the base and they capture the French troops. And the French at that point are done with the war. We had supported them with money, we had supported them with munitions, equipment. We had given them everything except personnel, and it was a losing cause. So once the French pull out, what's going to happen in Vietnam? You've got French troops leaving. In the north, you have a dominant communist presence, the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh. You've got a lot of his followers in the south as well. And I've kind of gone through all of this without mentioning Korea, which in the middle of all this, you had the Korean War that ended what? The United States and allied nations, the United Nations forces, fought to a draw and divided Korea and left it as a divided nation, as it still is today, with the communist forces in the north and the free democratic forces in the south. Well, Vietnam is temporarily divided by the Geneva Accords. There will be national elections held in 1956. That's the plan. Diem, who was Prime Minister of Vietnam, okay, he and the United States refused to sign these accords. And so the Soviet delegation blocks the US proposal to conduct elections under the United Nations. They want these elections to go on in Vietnam without outside interference, which means the Vietnamese themselves and the Viet Minh will be able to influence the outcome. So it's at this juncture, this gap between 1954 and 1956, that people have an opportunity to go where they want to be in Vietnam. There will be thousands of people in northern Vietnam, many of them Catholics, who want to flee from communist oppression, and the communists are being pretty ruthless with many of the people opposed to them in the north. So they're fleeing to the south. Meanwhile, there will be people in the south who go up to north. So there's this two-way movement. The United States and France and others helped transport over 500,000 people, some of them French citizens, many of them Vietnamese nationalists. And so what we have is a hardening of lines, where in the south, Prime Minister Diem, now President Diem, he will rule South Vietnam and control their army. And in the north, you have Ho Chi Minh gathering his forces, all looking forward to this 1956 election, which, as it turns out, is not going to happen. The deadline comes. Diem is opposed to the election because he knows that the Viet Minh will probably not allow fair elections to happen. Ho Chi Minh is probably going to be the winner even in a free and fair election, and he is going to lose his power, and Vietnam will most likely become a communist nation as a result of any open elections. And so he says, we won't be participating in that election, and the United States backs him in that decision, and we start pouring support, not to the French anymore, but giving our support to the South Vietnamese. The first Americans who will be killed in South Vietnam, this will be early on, this is 1958, I believe, 2 Americans killed by Saigon terrorists. Notice 1959, Ho Chi Minh declares a people's war to unite Vietnam. So this is open warfare as far as North Vietnamese are concerned. It's no longer a matter of negotiation. This is a matter of soldier against soldier, or civilian soldier, Viet Cong, against the South Vietnamese. Diem cracks down in 1960. They institute a universal draft, okay? Thousands of people will flee. He is a Catholic, and so this is when you start to get persecution of Buddhists and others. And so the North Vietnamese forces, the NVA forces in uniform, those are troops under Ho Chi Minh, but they also create this National Liberation Front in the South, and we know these folks as the Viet Cong. These are the people who during the day are trading with Americans, are driving in the same streets as Americans, in the same shops, but at night they're also the ones who would be attacking American air bases and so forth. So here's a solution. Americans sometimes come up with, great solutions to things, and other times terrible. And in this case, this is a really bad idea. They decide on this plan of creating strategic hamlets where these villages that would be subject to attacks or coercion by enemy forces would be basically packed up and moved to places that could be encircled with moats and barbed wire. So you might live in the Vietnamese countryside, and our fear was that North Vietnamese regulars or Viet Cong infiltrators would be coming into your village at night and taking supplies from you, getting comfort and aid from you, or forcing you to do things and drafting your young men. So to prevent that, we'll just move you away from your home, from your farms, and put you in these artificial compounds. While this is going on, Russia pledges their support for the North Vietnamese, and JFK steps up the number of Americans by sending Green Beret advisors to Vietnam. So this is 1960. This is before Americans think that we are at war in Vietnam. They just know that bad stuff's going on over there. McNamara proposes to send 200,000 troops, and JFK rejects it. We start to bomb hamlets controlled by the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, in '62, okay? But we supposedly will respect the boundary of Laos and Cambodia. We won't carry the war into those areas, although the North Vietnamese certainly will, because that's where the Ho Chi Minh Trail is coming through. So we basically are saying that's a safe area for you because we're not allowed to send troops or bombers there, and yet they're bringing personnel and supplies down there in great numbers. Large Viet Cong units are forming in central Vietnam, south of the 17th parallel, and McNamara reports, the first of many reports, we're winning the war. That's '62. This is when, again, this is probably a picture that appeared in Life magazine. Buddhist protests in Saigon, protests against the rule of Diem, who was, again, a Catholic, and it was actually his brother, who was a Catholic bishop, who headed up a lot of this persecution. And then you have, in 1963, JFK will be assassinated, and Diem will be assassinated. And the thing about this that you need to know is that during the time that the United States was involved with Vietnam, with South Vietnam, there was a succession of leaders. This guy was probably the best competent leader during the time of our involvement. But things weren't going the way that we had hoped. his generals were conspiring against him, and they worked out an assassination scheme that we knew about, and we let it be known that we would stand back, and they killed Diem. Some people have argued there's a connection between these two. Probably not the case. But what happens is we lose a leader and they lose their leader. There's a lot of speculation about what might have happened if JFK had not been killed, but he was, and so it becomes a war for LBJ to handle. Robert McNamara stays on, and he articulates what we're doing. Our role in South Vietnam is to answer the call of the South Vietnamese to help prevent the strategic danger if communism absorbs Southeast Asia. So we are allegedly, number one, coming to the aid of our ally. And remember, our ally had been Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh at one time, but now our ally is their enemy, okay? And also, we're seeing that this is where the policy of containment, this is where we stop the communist expansion. So in a sense, you could say we counted on the French to halt the communists. They didn't succeed. Now we're counting on the South Vietnamese to halt the communists. And they, on their own, are not going to succeed. Then comes this kind of notorious little episode known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where in August of 1964, reports come back to LBJ that one of our warships has been attacked, and then the next night it's attacked again. We now know that the first attack was to some degree legitimate. There were PT boats sent out against a US destroyer. There was, I believe, one bullet hole identified on the destroyer. That was the total damage done to the US ship. We called in planes and we pretty much took care of the attacking force. The second night, it's argued that there was no attack at all, that this was interference caused by weather and other things. What was the warship doing? It was in international waters, but it was monitoring, it was an intelligence operation, and what we didn't know was the South Vietnamese, meanwhile, had operatives on a covert mission up in the same area. So there's a lot going on up there, but this is what LBJ uses as the excuse or the justification that he needs. In essence, LBJ is out of patience. We've been now involved, the French left in 1954. We stepped in and we became involved, continued to be involved in terms of supplying money and materials, but we got involved with supplying advisors and so forth back in the late 50s. Now it's 1964, and we don't seem to be coming any closer to ending this conflict, winning this war. LBJ, this bold kind of Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, manly man from Texas, thinks, I can end this war by bombing those North Vietnamese into submission. And so he uses this attack in the Gulf of Tonkin to basically say, they've attacked us, we need to respond, and that response will be Operation Rolling Thunder. If you are going to pound North Vietnam with bombs, then you need planes, and planes need air bases. Some planes can fly off aircraft carriers, but the big, heavy B-52s and so forth, they need air bases like Da Nang. And so we established those air bases, which are vulnerable to attack, and so that's the reason to send the Marines in to defend the air bases. And it doesn't take long before it's shown that you can't defend an air base by sitting in a tent on the air base waiting for the mortars to come in at night. You have to get out on missions, reconnaissance missions, and patrol the area. And those reconnaissance missions, I think people who serve in Vietnam would tell you, quickly became search and destroy missions. So now we are engaged in a ground operation using ground troops, particularly the Marines at first, where we allegedly we're just going to pound the Vietnamese with our bombers, but we need the ground troops to support that effort. And so you see 3,500 Marines come in 1965. And this is the point at which Americans start to really pay attention. They start to understand that not only is this distant war going on in this place called Vietnam, but now we are dropping bombs there and we're sending troops there. And some people are not happy about that. That unhappiness really increases after the Battle of the Yardrang Valley. If you've seen the movie, We Were Soldiers Once and Young with, who is it? I forget the actor in it. I'm sorry? Mel Gibson, right. This was not a good experience for the Americans. We had mobile forces. We had aircraft, helicopters that could take men far and wide in Vietnam. And what that meant was we could take troops off a relatively safe airbase and drop them into the middle of a terrible situation. We could place them in, not only in harm's way, we could place them in what was almost an untenable, unwinnable situation if our intelligence was not correct. If you're going to helicopter several hundred men into the middle of a jungle, it's good to know who else is in that jungle. And in this case, we choppered men into the middle of a much larger North Vietnamese force. And the result was this battle. And if you see this movie, our men fought valiantly and held off a much superior force in terms of numbers. It's our aircraft that throughout the war would be the deciding point or the determining point whether our troops were wiped out or not. Our artillery support and our aircraft support would keep many men from being overrun. And this was one of those situations. What the movie doesn't tell you is it's the day after at Operation Albany that many more men are killed. And so this is the first significant loss of American troops. And Americans start to react to that. And the news outlets, CBS, ABC, NBC, start sending a lot of reporters over. And there are images that come back now to American televisions, you know, the nighttime news, showing things like Marines setting fire to villages, to huts, where we think the communists are coming in at night, the NVA, the Viet Cong, and those are serving as bases of operations and supply stations for them. And so we're going to eliminate them and take the people out. And once we do that, once we burn that village down, and once we take the people out, then that becomes a free fire zone. Anything in there can be killed. The people don't all leave, so they will live in a terribly dangerous situation. And during these operations of trying to clear these villages out, many people are killed who are not enemy combatants. They just happen to be collateral damage of the war. This is when you start to see war protests, anti-war rallies in 40 cities, and this is back around 1965. 66, our bombers continue in Operation Rolling Thunder to pound Vietnam. You know, you can't just bomb North Vietnam because actually there's a huge enemy presence in many parts of South Vietnam. Even south of, well, if you look at the map, I probably should have kept a map here. If you look at the area like Saigon, you think, well, that at least should be an area of safety for Americans and South Vietnamese troops. South of that and north of that, very, very dangerous, many enemy troops. And when you get into the highlands, it's a no man's land. So we see a lot more of our bombers and our jets being shot down. There's a growing number of American prisoners of war in the Hanoi Hilton. And they are being paraded in front of the world by the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese. And our casualty count is going up. So you can see 1966, we have 389,000 men in Vietnam. And that number is on the rise. 67, we bombed Haiphong Harbor. We had held off doing that because we didn't want to hit any Russian ships. We didn't want to mine Haiphong Harbor. You don't want to invite the Russians into the battle, and you have to be careful to not invite the Chinese to come in as they had in Korea. So we're kind of walking on quicksand here, but Westmoreland is still trying to beef up American presence to win this war. He asked for 200,000 reinforcements. And you can see the estimated Viet Cong and NVA strength, 300,000. There were people in Washington who argued that, well, we're so much better equipped and better trained that we know we're going to lose men, but for every one of our men we lose, we take 10 of their men. It's this terrible arithmetic, a war of attrition that says they're going to run out of men. So we have to accept we'll lose some, knowing that in the end we're going to win the war because they'll run out and we won't. This is a very flawed kind of reasoning. McNamara in '67 will resign after not only immense protests across the nation, but also when it's clear that the strategy he's advocating is not succeeding. '68, critical year in the war. Peace talks begin and immediately stall. They actually spend a couple of weeks arguing about the shape of the table they'll have the talks around. Westmoreland is replaced, and this is when you have a presidential election. You may recall that the contender, the leading contender you would expect for the Democrats would have been LBJ. But then you had LBJ doing terribly in the polls, and you had an anti-war candidate, Eugene McCarthy, who came out of nowhere to win the New Hampshire primary. And it's at that moment Bobby Kennedy jumps into the race, and he looks like the guy who will take over the Democratic mantle, but he, of course, is assassinated. So when they are holding an open election, or convention, I should say, in Chicago, that's the moment that the Students for a Democratic Society and other protesters decide to come out and make their presence known, make their feelings known, and Mayor Daley and the Chicago police turn it into a real bloodfest. Either side of that you want to be on, whether it's the anti-war side or the law and order side, the free and fair election side, without interference, it was a mess. Nobody won in that election, although Humphrey was nominated, only to lose. '68 is also a year of the siege of Khe Sanh. This, it looked like, was the moment that could have been our Dien Bien Phu. The French had been encircled, lost, and that ended the war for them. LBJ made sure that that wasn't going to happen to us. We had planes stacked up, waiting to bomb the enemy all around our men up in Khe Sanh. And so from January to July 9th, Americans held their breath watching this story about could our troops survive? Could they fight off the Vietnamese? And with the help of those bombers and jet fighters, they did. At that point, Americans think, perhaps we can do what it takes. We have the manpower, we have the equipment to win this. Our generals announce that we're winning the war, and then comes the Tet Offensive. And in the Tet Offensive, Vietnamese sweep into over 100 cities and towns, including Saigon, and they shock Americans in this attack of such a vast scale that it totally defied everything the government had been telling us about how the war was going. If you look at the documents, if you look at the battle on paper, many people will tell you or will point out militarily, this was a victory for the South Vietnamese and the Americans. They killed far more people, okay? The enemy losses were far higher, and they didn't hold on to these towns and cities they attacked. But in the United States, this was such a shock that this turned out to be a tremendous victory in terms of morale and in terms of persuasion for the enemy, for the North Vietnamese. I might say, I teach the American Revolution course. George Washington hadn't won a battle at all when he takes his troops across the Delaware and they defeat the Hessians at Trenton. Trenton was not an important military objective, but what it did was it boosted the morale of his troops, of Americans. It boosted enlistments. It said, hey, maybe we can beat these people. And this was a case where we got just the opposite message. And it was, we were told we're winning, and look at what they did to us. And don't talk to us about casualties. The fact that they could attack all these people, all these places, even attack our embassy in Saigon, this was crushing news. There had been a massacre at My Lai in 1968 that was kept under wraps, if you will. I know you've heard of this. You know there are a tragic number of casualties, innocent women and children just shot down, thrown in ditches, put in places with grenades dropped on them. And so this was a true war crime, an atrocity. It didn't come out for about 2 years, but when the news did come out, that's when you really got a lot of very strong anti-war rhetoric. When Vietnam veterans talk about coming back and getting spit on and getting called baby killers, that really intensified after the news of this came out. Also in 1968, a real seminal year, okay? Not only does Bobby Kennedy get assassinated, Martin Luther King gets assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson basically looks at the writing on the wall, and he knows that he won't run for re-election. He's going to step aside after one term. That opens the door for Richard Nixon, the guy who said you won't have me to kick around anymore after he lost to Kennedy. Well, he's back, and he's back strong. He wins in a landslide. He talks about having a secret plan to win the war. And part of his secret plan is he's going to start bombing Cambodia. We're not going to allow the Ho Chi Minh Trail to be used without us going after those men and those supplies, those men and women. Actually, North Vietnam had an incredible number of women in uniform and performing different operations. But it's also 69 that the My Lai massacre is exposed. And you start getting these massive protests in a lot of US cities. So Nixon decides that the way for us to reach an honorable peace and withdrawal is to turn over the war to the Vietnamese. Basically to try and return to where we had been back in 1958, where we will supply money and materials and let them do the fighting. We've adopted a plan we've worked out in cooperation. South Vietnamese aren't given any choice in this. The withdrawal of all US ground forces and the replacement by South Vietnamese forces, November 1969. Well, everybody can see the handwriting on the wall here. Kissinger, who is, if you're looking for villains, Henry Kissinger would be high on the list. He begins these secret talks, which he and Nixon will agree that they don't want those talks to get too far before the '72 election. They want to make sure that Nixon wins re-election. So if the talks are moving too fast, they need to be halted or delayed in some way. So Nixon announces to the public our incursion into Cambodia. The Senate repeals the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The Senate, the Congress, is starting to look for a way out. And they banned the use of US troops in Laos and Cambodia, really opposing what Nixon seems to be using as the new policy or the new tactic. 71, we are now in not only Vietnam, but we're in Laos and Cambodia. And the more veterans you talk to, the more people you'll meet that will say, well, I can tell you now where I was, but back then I couldn't tell you where I was because we supposedly weren't over the fence. We weren't over there, okay? Among the protesters, you start to hear from a lot of Vietnam vets. So the Vietnam Veterans Against the War become a very visible presence. And the last Marine combat units will depart in 71. Those troops that are still in Vietnam, who wants to be the last man killed in this war, the last American to die, right? So the morale of the troops is down. Another thing I should point out is that early in the war, you had a lot more of our forces were volunteers. When the Marines went in, it was a very high percentage of volunteers. Then over time, as the regular Army and you had Air Force and Navy went in, there was a mix of career men, lifers, and of men who were young men who were drafted. Towards the end of the war, the number of draftees was much higher. The amount of drug use was much higher. You can't necessarily say, oh, that's because of the draftees. It wasn't just the draftees, okay? But when you think about the morale, you think about what's going on, you can understand drug use will be a problem. Having a lot of men over there who didn't want to be there in the first place is a problem. Men in uniform will tell you the insanity of a strategy where by the time somebody knows what they're doing, you know, you put somebody who's green in Vietnam, by the time they know how to stay alive and know how to fight, their year is up. And they come out and you replace them with somebody else who doesn't know what they're doing. So this policy of rotation after a year really works against having a trained force. You're really depending on your lifers, on your men who will re-up, who will sign again to carry the great burden. And men will talk about not wanting to form friendships with the new guys because they'll get killed so often, killed so fast. And at this time, morale was so low that you also could get killed fast if you were an officer who was ordering your men to do something that they knew was likely to get them killed, something they knew better. I had a co-worker in Boston who, in fact, was sent to military prison for fragging, rolling a grenade into the officer's mess. Because the officer had ordered them to walk down a trail that they said, no, if we do that, we're going to find mines or ambushes, and he insisted on it, and sure enough, somebody got blown up, and he got fragged. And so things like this, the war was getting uglier in so many ways. But our troop levels are dropping, and this is when the Pentagon Papers come out, and Americans, their eyes are now opened by finding out the truth of what went on in the 1950s, and they start to understand the politics behind this war that people never understood before. Some of those earlier passages I showed you, people didn't have access to that information until these Pentagon Papers came out. So the protests, including veterans, were really stepped up. Testimony before Congress where veterans would come out, here's John Kerry, and basically talk about what it was really like in Vietnam, which some veterans were very upset about because they said that these were the bad guys talking about what they did and they weren't representing the average soldier. I can't tell you what's true or not true about that. I think you'd have to talk to Vietnam veterans and say, based on your experience, should these guys have been believed or were they like the bad apples? Leave that up to you to decide, but it was a powerful time in terms of American public opinion. And the protests, the anti-war protests, some people think it's all long-haired radical hippies. And that was not the truth. We're talking about middle America coming out, being very upset about their sons and daughters, their husbands, their relatives, their friends going over to Vietnam in what by now seemed to be a pointless war, a war we had been lied to about. And so here you see the Times and the Pentagon Papers. The government did try to suppress these to keep them from being published, but that didn't happen. So 72, we're interested in one thing, getting out. Even if that means that the expectation is the South Vietnamese are going to have to fight on their own with whatever material supplies we give them. And we are making those promises. Don't worry, we're removing our troops, but we'll be there for you with whatever you need in terms of money and supplies. President Tu denounces this peace proposal worked out by Kissinger. For their part, the North Vietnamese begin a major offensive, and Nixon gets what he wanted more than anything. He's reelected in a landslide. But of course, be careful what you wish for, because you know what's coming for Nixon and Watergate. So by 73, the head of South Vietnam, President Tu, is forced to accept a peace agreement that he totally abhors, that he disagrees with. Nixon announces, we're ending the war with peace and honor. We signed the Paris Peace Accords. Hanoi releases our prisoners of war. And March 29th, 73, the last American troops withdraw. I know you've all at some point seen the picture in Saigon of our troops and the helicopters landing at the top, taking the last people they could, and choppers flying out to the ships in the Gulf and being pushed off the edge to make room for others as people desperately tried to get out of South Vietnam. And the Case Church Amendment forbids further involvement in Southeast Asia. So we are out and we make it clear we have no intention of going back in, even though the agreement is that if there's an invasion, we're ready to come back to their aid. Well, we're not going to do that. 74, Nixon's going to have to resign. Ford will announce clemency for draft evaders. The NVA is really deep into South Vietnam in their major offensive, pushing towards Saigon. Ford insists we're not getting back into that war, and people in South Vietnam are getting out any way they could, because if you fought in the South Vietnamese army or if you worked for the Americans in any capacity, your life is in grave danger. And this is a famous photo of the North Vietnamese troops coming in to the embassy in Saigon. And here's that picture I was talking about. President Tu is forced to resign, and he points out, very pointedly says, the United States has not respected its promises, it's inhumane, it's untrustworthy, it's irresponsible. This was our peace with honor. And the people had to turn and try and welcome the North Vietnamese in, because those who were identified as being on the other side of the ledger would be forced into labor camps or just executed outright, as the NVA had handled people in the city of Hue and just killed them by the thousands and thrown them in mass graves. And Vietnam will become what we feared all along, a communist nation. And I'll just very quickly show you, in terms of personnel, you can see that 1968 was the peak time with over 500,000 men in country. In terms of casualties, you can see the numbers follow the same chart, the same pattern, with 16.6 thousand killed. One thing I might remind you is, when Nixon is elected and we supposedly start peace talks, okay, there had still been, all the numbers since then or after then, you could argue, were people who didn't have to die in this war. Of course, if we had made good policy decisions and handled things in a different way, maybe none of those people would have died in the war, but that's all speculative at this point. Estimated deaths overall, 2.5 million, or 2.2 million civilians, okay? The enemy lost a tremendous number of people. The South Vietnamese soldiers, you know, there's really a mixed report card on them. You'll hear reports that they would turn and run. You would hear reports that they couldn't be depended on, but you also hear reports that some of them were great fighters and they did some of the hardest fighting early in the war, and that they made a great ally. So again, it depends on who you talk to, where they were, and when they were, because one thing that hopefully I've shown you about this war is it's very difficult to generalize and say this is the way things were, because the way things were in 1964 is very different than 66 and 68 and 72. The condition, the circumstances changed, the people changed, the leaders changed. As it was pointed out to me by somebody just before this, the soldiers couldn't win when the politicians were trying to set strategy in Washington and not the generals do it. And there's probably a lot of truth in that, but there's also a lot of truth in the fact that we got into this mess on a set of false promises and bad assumptions, and even the best generals, if they were restrained from using every weapon we had, perhaps this war was unwinnable. If you can't determine who's your enemy and who's not when you look at a group of people in South Vietnam, it's hard to know who you're supposed to shoot at. And if you use all the weapons in our arsenal, excuse me, you're going to probably invite Soviet Union and Russia to join the war. Casualties, here's some more numbers. You can see more and more African American soldiers were drafted in the latter half of the war, so a lot of the casualties in terms of percentage were higher than in our national percentage. The average age, 23 years, but 61% were younger than 21. So these are young men being killed. 70% of the men killed were volunteers. And 114 men died in captivity. In terms of wounded, terrible wounds, and these tend to be battlefield wounds, the numbers at top, but how many suffered later on from complications from Agent Orange, and untold thousands came back and would suffer and still suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. So the toll of this war continues. Financially, not nearly as important as the human toll, but that's a big investment. War is expensive. $28.5 billion in economic aid to the Saigon regime. And before that, we had spent billions supporting the French. We really wanted somebody else to fight the communists. And when we went in and did it, we were no more successful than the proxies, because the French tried it before us and failed. We fought them and failed, and we left the job to the South Vietnamese, and they ultimately failed. The air war, this map, every one of these dots represents a certain number of bombs. So you can see that the amount of bombs that we dropped, and look where they dropped. If we're battling the North Vietnamese, you'd think the North Vietnam would be where you'd see most of the bombs dropped. Look at South Vietnam. We dropped 6.1 million tons of bombs, 3 times what we dropped in the Second World War. And lost a lot of planes, and of course, Agent Orange not only hurt our men, but hurt their people and their countryside. And so where'd we all end up? We couldn't let the communists take over Vietnam because the rest of Southeast Asia would go communist. Well, that didn't happen. In 1995, we restored diplomatic relations, and the embargo fully lifted. Here is Obama with the leader of Vietnam down in Ho Chi Minh City. So that's what I have for you. I can't say that I told you what it was like to go fight the war in Vietnam, but hopefully you have a better understanding of the politics of the war. A lot of what I've told you, undoubtedly you already knew, but often when I give this talk, veterans will tell me, well, I was over there, but I didn't know all this background. And I think the more background you hear, probably the more disappointed you are in our leadership. I wish, how do I say this? I do not wish that I had gone to Vietnam, but I wish I knew more or better about what it was like there. I do read a lot, I talk to a lot of people, I watch videos all the time. One of the, I can say a lot of bad things about electronics, and my students will tell you I'm the first guy to throw a kid out of class because of his cell phone. But I do believe in just sitting down with YouTube and just going in and finding things that I didn't even know were there. Learning is one of the joys of life. And so if you're looking to hear or to see glimpses of what it was like to actually be a grunt in Vietnam, there's stuff on YouTube that will tell you, that will give you firsthand accounts and images from the war. And I had some friends who were over there, but I've probably gotten much more information just from talking to people who were strangers when I met them. When I teach the class in Vietnam, during the regular semester at Coastal, right now I'm teaching it in Maymester, so everybody's remote. But when I teach it in the classroom class, and I try to get Vietnam veterans involved, one thing I've found is that you can get people who were maintaining aircraft, or were in supplies, or maybe were working ships. But if you want somebody who is in the deep jungle, they don't want to talk about it a lot of times. They just say, I don't want to go back and relive that, and I don't care to talk about a lot of things that happened over there. And so that alone tells me that it was, just must have been a terrible, terrible experience. And to go from having people who don't know you, you don't know them, and they're trying to kill you and you're trying to kill them, and then to get on a plane and find yourself on the streets of Boston, I can't imagine what that was like for them. And some of those people just never got over that. I did have a slide previously that talked about the excellent care that our soldiers got when they were injured in combat, in terms of if they could get them back to a medical unit within an hour or something. I got one woman very upset when I talked about there being excellent medical care in Vietnam, because her husband had been subjected to Agent Orange and had developed cancer and had passed as a result. And she basically said to me, how can you say he had excellent medical care? So I can say, based on what I've been told and what I've read, if you were a soldier in Vietnam and you got shot or blown up, you had a better chance of surviving than you would have in some other war. But that doesn't say anything about how they were treated when they got back. If you go watch Tom Cruise, Born on the 4th of July, if you know that movie, okay? How the the Veterans Affairs, how those hospitals were equipped and could handle them or couldn't handle them, and then the things like Agent Orange, the effects of that, and PTSD. There's a much greater toll to be paid. So those guys who lost a leg in Vietnam, our hearts go out to them, but in a sense, that was only one kind of injury in Vietnam. There are a lot of others too. Yeah. I know some of you have things to do on a Saturday afternoon, so I want to thank you all for being here. If you have a question you still want to ask, I'm going to hang around a little bit, but thank you. I hope you found it informative. And if you disagree with me, please come up and feel free to disagree with me. I'm always glad to hear and to learn from people who know better than I do. Okay, thank you.